Most homesteaders have all the pieces, but none of the connections. You're managing chickens that need purchase feed while your garden needs purchase fertilizer, and you're buying vegetables at the store to make up the difference. Three separate expensive systems running in the same backyard. Meanwhile, traditional homesteads fed families for generations by connecting those pieces into one loop, where each part solved the problem the other created. Animals fertilize beds. Beds grow animal feed. Scraps feed animals. The system regulates itself. But here's the reality. Garden centers profit from disconnection. Every bag of feed and fertilizer you buy is fixing a design problem. Here's the Hillbilly Loop system that eliminates dependency. The fundamental mistake creating those feed bills and weekend maintenance shifts is treating animals and gardens as two separate projects that both require constant external inputs. You're running a chicken operation that needs purchased feed and a garden operation that needs purchased fertilizer, when traditional homesteads understood they're two halves of one self-regulating engine. Think about it. You're buying feed to produce manure, then buying fertilizer made from someone else's manure to feed beds that could be growing chicken feed. You're throwing kitchen scraps in the trash that chickens would convert to eggs. You're hauling chicken manure to a compost pile, then hauling finished compost to beds, when you could eliminate both steps by designing the connection directly. Here's what most people miss. Modern homesteading goes completely backwards because every solution you buy from the garden center is fixing a problem your disconnected design created. Meanwhile, indigenous growers and subsistence farmers ran closed loops for centuries with practically zero external inputs because they observed relationships instead of buying products. The Three Sisters system wasn't three separate crops requiring three separate inputs. It was one integrated engine where corn provided structure, beans fixed nitrogen, and squash shaded weeds while all three fed the family, and the excess fed animals whose manure built the soil for the next planting. But here's the reality. You're buying corn from the feed store, nitrogen fertilizer from the garden center, and weed killer from the same aisle, then wondering why a backyard homestead costs $400 monthly to operate. The system you're running requires intervention and products. The system they ran required observation and relationships. And you can shift from one to the other without more space, more money, or more work. You just need to connect 3 animals and 4 beds in the right sequence. The Hillbilly Loop works because waste never leaves the property, and every output from one part becomes the input for another. Animals produce manure, and beds need fertility, which means you're not buying fertilizer. Beds produce food, and animals need feed, which means you're not buying feed. Kitchen scraps need disposal, and animals need supplemental nutrition, which means scraps become eggs instead of landfill waste. Garden trimmings create waste, and animals turn them into meat or milk. When you close these loops, you're not managing 4 separate systems bleeding money. You're running one system that regulates itself because each part solves the problem the other part creates. Which means feed bills drop towards zero because beds are growing animal feed as a built-in crop. The fertilizer bills disappear because animals are producing exactly what beds need exactly when they need it. And the labor drops by half because you're not fighting problems your disconnected design created. You're maintaining relationships your design embedded from the start. Now let's talk about the 3 animals and why these specific roles matter. The first animal is chickens, and here's what most people miss. Chickens aren't just egg producers requiring expensive feed. They're mobile pest control, nitrogen generators, kitchen scrap processors, and soil aerators that work for free if you design their movement correctly. You need 6 to 12 birds depending on family size. 6 hens produce 4 to 6 eggs daily year-round, which covers most family egg needs, and their manure provides enough nitrogen for 2 4 by 20-foot beds annually. But this is where it gets interesting. Chickens in a mobile tractor or rotational system do 5 jobs simultaneously. They eat insects and larvae that would damage crops, which means you're not buying or applying pest control. They scratch and aerate soil, which means you're not tilling. They deposit manure directly where you'll plant next, which means you're not hauling or composting separately. They eat kitchen scraps and garden trimmings, which means you're not managing waste or buying supplemental feed. And they clear cover crops and weeds from fallow beds, which means you're not mowing or hand weeding. 5 functions from one design element. Meanwhile, you're probably paying separately for each of those functions right now. The practical setup is simple. You build or buy a mobile chicken tractor, which is just a lightweight coop on wheels or skids that you move every few days. Or you use rotational paddocks with portable fencing if you have more space. The chickens live in one area for 3 to 7 days, then you move them to the next zone. They forage, scratch, manure, and move on. Which means bed 4 in your rotation becomes the chicken zone during its fallow period. They clear it, fertilize it, and prep it for the next growing cycle without you touching a shovel or pushing a wheelbarrow. You're not managing chickens in beds separately. You're integrating them so their natural behavior does the work your labor and money used to do. A mobile tractor for 6 to 12 chickens costs $200 to build or $400 to buy once, and it eliminates $100 monthly in feed costs, $30 monthly in fertilizer, and hours every week in pest management and soil prep. Think about it. One $200 investment replaces $1,560 in annual costs, plus 50 to 80 hours of manual labor. But chickens alone won't close the loop. Their manure is high in nitrogen but takes weeks to compost safely before you can apply it to beds, and they can't process all your kitchen scraps efficiently. This is why the second animal matters. Rabbits produce manure that's safe to apply fresh, doesn't burn plants, and actually improves soil structure immediately without composting lag. 4 breeding rabbits produce enough manure to fertilize one 4x20-foot bed continuously. Plus, they provide 150 to 200 pounds of meat annually if you're breeding for food, or you keep them purely as manure engines if meat production isn't your goal. And here's the part that changes everything. Rabbits live in hutches that you position directly over beds or over worm bins. Their manure drops through the wire floor continuously. You're not collecting it, composting it, or hauling it. It falls exactly where you need it, exactly when the plants need it. Which means you've eliminated the entire fertilizer collection and application process. The system runs passively while you sleep. Rabbits eat kitchen scraps chickens won't touch, plus they thrive on perennial fodder crops you plant once and harvest forever. Comfrey is the game changer here. You plant comfrey as a border around each bed. It grows 3 to 5 feet tall, you cut it every 4 to 6 weeks, and you feed the leaves to rabbits who convert it to manure that drops into the bed that grew the comfrey. You've closed a loop within the loop. The bed grows its own fertilizer source. The rabbits process it. The manure falls back into the bed. Nothing leaves. Nothing needs to be bought. Chicory, plantain, and dandelion work the same way. Plant them as perennial borders, harvest continuously, feed rabbits, collect manure. The third animal completes the loop and depends on your space and goals. If you have a 1/4 acre or more, goats make sense. 2 does produce milk or meat, clear brush and invasive species you'd otherwise fight manually, and generate massive amounts of manure that builds heavy feeder beds fast. Goats eat woody material chickens and rabbits won't touch, which means overgrown fence lines, saplings, and brambles become goat feed, instead of weekend projects you're paying yourself minimum wage to complete. They're browsers, not grazers, so they work in rough terrain or areas you wouldn't use for gardens anyway. And their manure is pelleted and easy to collect, or they deposit it directly in rotational paddocks you convert to garden beds after they move on. But here's the reality. If you're on a smaller lot or urban property, pigs replace goats in the loop, and they work faster than any machine you could rent. 1 or 2 pigs in a rotational system clear new garden space in 4 to 8 weeks. You fence off the area you want to convert, run pigs through it, and they root out every weed, rock, and rhizome while depositing manure 6 inches deep. Then you move them to the next zone and plant where they just worked. Meanwhile, you're probably hiring someone with a tiller or spending weekends with a mattock doing what a pig accomplishes by existing. Pigs eat kitchen scraps in volumes chickens can't match, process garden waste that would take months to compost, and turn it into fertilizer in days. Which means you're not managing compost piles or hauling materials to a municipal yard waste site. You're feeding pigs who process everything on site. A single pig converts 800 to 1,200 pounds of scraps and garden waste into usable manure annually, while producing 200 pounds of meat if you're raising for food. Now let's talk about the 4 beds and how the rotation keeps production continuous without burning out the soil or inviting pest explosions. This is where most homesteaders fail because they treat beds as static zones that grow the same crops in the same spots every year until disease and nutrient depletion make the whole system collapse and they're back at the garden center buying solutions. The loop system uses rotation to prevent problems before they start and to match crop needs with what the previous phase built into the soil. Think about it. Industrial agriculture fights the same pests and diseases year after year because monoculture invites them. You can run the opposite system in 320 square feet. Bed 1 is your heavy feeder zone, growing tomatoes, peppers, squash, corn, cucumbers, anything that demands high nitrogen and produces heavily. This bed gets direct applications of fresh rabbit manure or aged chicken manure because heavy feeders can handle and need that fertility load. You're planting in soil that's rich, loose, and ready to support big production. Bed 2 is your light feeder zone, growing lettuce, greens, herbs, peas, beans. These crops don't need heavy nitrogen. They thrive in the residual fertility left after bed 1 crops finish, which means you're not adding fertilizer. You're using what the previous rotation built. And here's what nobody tells you. Peas and beans actually fix nitrogen while they grow, so they're adding fertility for the next phase instead of depleting it. Which means bed 2 isn't just producing food, it's building soil for bed 3. Bed 3 grows root crops like carrots, beets, radishes, turnips, potatoes. Root crops need loose soil more than heavy fertility, and they benefit from the structure the previous crops created. This bed is building tilth and organic matter through root growth and decomposition. You're not fertilizing heavily, you're letting the plants do the work of improving soil structure. Bed 4 is your fallow or cover crop zone. This bed rests from food production and grows soil-building crops like clover, vetch, rye, buckwheat, or it serves as the chicken tractor zone where birds clear, scratch, manure, and prep for the next cycle. Meanwhile, conventional gardeners are fighting to keep the same bed productive year after year by adding more inputs, more amendments, more products from the garden center that's profiting from their design failure. Here's how the rotation works across seasons. In spring, bed 1 starts with tomatoes and squash getting fresh manure. Bed 2 has lettuce and peas using residual fertility. Bed 3 grows carrots and beets. Bed 4 is cover cropped or under chickens. By fall, bed 1's heavy feeders finish and the bed transitions to bed 2 status. You plant greens and herbs there for winter using the leftover fertility. Old bed 2 becomes bed 3 and you plant root crops. Old bed 3 becomes bed 4 and you seed cover crops or move chickens in. Old bed 4, now fertilized and cleared by chickens or enriched by cover crops, becomes the new bed 1 and you plant next spring's heavy feeders there. The rotation moves in sequence, and every bed cycles through all 4 rolls over 18 to 24 months. Which means no bed depletes, no pests establish permanent populations, and production stays high year after year because you're working with natural cycles instead of fighting them with purchased interventions. This is where it gets interesting. The feed sources are embedded in the design, so external purchases drop towards zero. Comfrey borders around beds produce 4 to 6 cuttings per year. One 10-foot comfrey row yields enough rabbit feed to replace $15 to $20 monthly in pellets. Multiply that by 4 beds, and you've replaced half your rabbit feed with perennial crops you plant once and harvest for 20 years. But here's what most people miss. Cover crops in the fallow bed aren't just soil builders, they're chicken forage. Buckwheat, clover, and rye produce seed heads chickens devour. You're growing chicken feed and soil fertility in the same crop at the same time. Meanwhile, you're buying bags of layer feed that cost $18 each when your beds could be producing it for free. Fodder trees like mulberry, willow, or Siberian pea shrub planted along fence lines or property edges produce leaves and pods goats and rabbits eat fresh. You're turning unused vertical space into animal feed, which means fewer purchased inputs and more closed loops running passively. Garden trimmings, bolted lettuce, spent pea vines, squash leaves after harvest, all become animal feed instead of compost pile material waiting to break down. You're feeding animals who return it as manure, that grows the next crop within days instead of months. Nothing leaves the property. Every output loops back as input. And here's the part nobody tells you. The longer the system runs, the less management it needs because the relationships strengthen and self-regulate. Here's what the numbers actually look like for a family of 4 running a conventional, disconnected homestead versus the loop system. Conventional costs break down as chicken feed at $45 monthly, garden fertilizer and amendments at $35 monthly, vegetable purchases to supplement what the garden doesn't produce at $120 monthly, and pest control or replacement plants at $15 monthly. That's $215 monthly or $2,580 annually just to run a backyard system that requires constant intervention and weekend labor. And those numbers assume you're not counting your time, which is another 6 to 10 hours weekly, fighting weeds, hauling materials, and applying products in a disconnected system. The loop system costs look completely different. You're buying supplemental minerals and grain during winter months when beds aren't producing fresh forage, which runs $12 to $18 monthly. You're replacing or eliminating fertilizer entirely, which was $35 monthly. You're growing 60 to 70% of vegetables instead of buying them, which cuts that $120 monthly grocery cost to $40. Total loop system annual cost runs $180 to $250 versus $2,580 for the disconnected model. That's $2,330 annual savings, and it assumes you're not selling excess eggs, meat, or vegetables, which many loop homesteaders do to cover the remaining costs entirely. Meanwhile, garden centers are running television ads convincing you that gardening requires their products when the opposite is true. But here's the reality. The labor comparison is even more dramatic. A disconnected system requires 6 to 10 hours weekly. You're watering beds because you haven't built passive water retention through mulch and soil structure. You're weeding monoculture rows because you haven't interplanted or used living mulches. You're fighting pests because your design invited them by planting the same crops in the same spots. You're hauling manure and compost because you're managing them separately instead of integrating them where they're produced and needed. The loop system requires 20 to 30 minutes daily for harvest, feeding, egg collection, and visual checks, plus maybe 2 hours monthly for moving chicken tractors, planting cover crops, or maintaining hutches. That's 12 to 15 hours monthly total versus 24 to 40 hours in the disconnected system. You're cutting labor in half while tripling yields because the design does the work. The relationships regulate themselves without your constant intervention. Yield numbers from 4 beds in rotation managed with the loop system run 400 to 600 pounds of vegetables annually, depending on climate and crop choices. That's compared to 120 to 180 pounds from the same bed space using conventional isolated methods requiring purchased fertilizer. You're producing 3 to 4 times more food from the same square footage because the soil never depletes, pests never establish, and the fertility cycle never breaks. Think about it. You're getting higher yields from less work and less money by designing relationships instead of managing problems. Add the animal production embedded in the same system. 12 chickens produce 2,500 to 3,000 eggs annually. 4 breeding rabbits produce 150 to 200 pounds of meat, or they simply produce manure if you're not raising for food. 2 goats produce 800 to 1,200 pounds of milk annually if you're milking, or they clear 2 to 3 acres of brush and brambles you'd otherwise fight manually or pay someone to clear. You're getting food, labor savings, and fertility from the same animals in the same system at the same time. Here's what most people miss. Space requirements for the minimum viable loop are smaller than most people assume. 4 beds at 4 by 8 feet each equals 128 square feet of growing space. A small chicken run or tractor zone needs 80 to 120 square feet. Stacked rabbit hutches need 16 square feet of floor space. Total system footprint runs 230 to 270 square feet, which fits in most suburban backyards, side yards, or even large patios if you're using containers for beds. The beds don't have to be in-ground. Raised beds, container beds, or even fabric grow bags work in the rotation system. as long as you maintain the fertility cycle and the animal integration, which means renters, HOA-restricted properties, and urban lots can all run scaled versions of the loop without owning land or fighting regulations designed to keep you dependent on grocery stores. Container loop version for balconies or patios uses 2 to 4 large fabric grow bags as the bed rotation, worm bins instead of full rabbit hutches where composting worms process kitchen scraps into castings you use as fertilizer, and quail instead of chickens if local laws prohibit chickens. Quail produce eggs, require minimal space, and their manure works the same as chicken manure in the system. You're running a 50-square-foot loop that produces eggs, vegetables, and compost from scraps that would otherwise go to the landfill while your neighbors are driving to the grocery store weekly. Suburban loop for typical quarter-acre properties uses the full 4-bed system, 6 to 12 chickens, 4 rabbits, and optional goats if zoning allows. You're producing 70 to 80% of your family's vegetables and eggs while spending $15 monthly on supplemental inputs. Meanwhile, your disconnected neighbors are spending $400 monthly and complaining that homesteading is expensive and time-consuming because nobody showed them how to close the loops. HOA-compliant loop disguises the system as ornamental landscaping. Beds grow edibles that look decorative like kale, chard, herbs, and dwarf fruit trees. Rabbits live in hutches designed to look like garden sheds or attractive furniture. Chickens are kept as pets where allowed, or you skip them and rely entirely on rabbits and worm bins for fertility. You're closing the loop within restrictions that try to prevent exactly this kind of self-reliance, because dependent consumers are more profitable than independent producers. Implementation timeline for going from zero to full loop runs 12 to 18 months if you phase it strategically, instead of trying to build everything at once and getting overwhelmed. Start spring of year 1 with 6 chickens and a mobile tractor and 1 bed. That's $200 for the tractor, $90 for birds, $40 for 1 bed of materials if you're building raised beds. You're spending $330 to close the first loop. The chickens eat your kitchen scraps starting immediately. You move them to clear and fertilize the bed area before planting. You plant the bed with heavy feeders and comfrey borders. By summer, you're harvesting vegetables and the comfrey is established. Add rabbits in late summer. 2 does and 1 buck cost $60 to $90 depending on breed. Build or buy hutches for $150 to $200. Position them over a second bed or over worm bins. You're spending another $240 and you've closed the second loop. Rabbits eat kitchen scraps chickens don't want, plus the comfrey you're cutting from bed 1. Their manure drops into bed 2. You plant bed 2 in fall with greens and root crops. By winter of year 1, you're harvesting from 2 beds, collecting eggs daily, and you've stopped buying fertilizer completely. Add bed 3 in spring of year 2, using manure both animals produced over winter. Add bed 4 by summer and designate it as your fallow cover crop chicken zone. You're now running the full rotation. Add the third animal, goats or pigs, only if you have space and need their specific functions. Otherwise, the chicken-rabbit bed system closes the loop completely for most families. Record-keeping needs are minimal, but essential for refining timing. A simple notebook tracking which bed is in which rotation role, when you planted what crops, when you applied manure, and monthly feed costs lets you see patterns and optimize year after year. Most loop homesteaders find feed costs drop to near zero by year 2, once perennial fodder crops mature and cover crop timing aligns with animal needs. The system becomes more efficient the longer it runs, because relationships strengthen, soil improves continuously, and your observation skills sharpen. You're not following a rigid protocol. You're stewarding a living system that teaches you how it wants to work if you pay attention instead of buying solutions. Here's what this means in practice. Instead of driving to the feed store every month and spending $45 on chicken feed, you're cutting comfrey and fodder every week and buying maybe $8 in supplemental grain during deep winter. Instead of buying vegetables at the grocery store year-round, you're harvesting from beds every single week and only buying tropical fruits or off-season items you can't grow in your climate. Instead of spending Saturday mornings weeding, watering, and fighting pests with products you bought, you're spending 20 minutes daily checking animals, harvesting food, and observing what needs attention. Instead of hauling bags of manure and compost you purchased from the garden center, you're watching rabbits and chickens produce it passively exactly where you need it while you sleep. Instead of managing waste streams leaving your property in trash bags, you're cycling everything internally, where waste becomes wealth and problems become solutions. The philosophical shift matters more than the mechanics. You're not fighting against nature or trying to dominate it with products and interventions sold by companies profiting from your dependency. You're observing relationships and designing connections that let those relationships regulate the system, which means you stop being a consumer dependent on external inputs and become a producer working with biological cycles that existed long before garden centers convinced you gardening required their help. Traditional homesteads understood this instinctively because they had to. They couldn't buy solutions. They had to observe what worked and build systems around those observations. The 3 animals and 4 beds loop isn't primitive or backward. It's the most sophisticated system you can run because it's resilient, self-regulating, and it works with biology instead of against it. The loop system isn't more complicated than what you're doing now. It's simpler. You design the connections once, then you maintain relationships instead of fighting problems your disconnected design created. Start today by getting 6 chickens and planting 1 bed with greens and comfrey borders. Let the chickens eat your kitchen scraps. Move them across the bed area before planting to clear and fertilize the soil. Use their manure in the bed. You've closed the first loop. Then add a second bed. Then add rabbits positioned over that second bed. Then add a third bed. Each connection makes the system more resilient and less dependent on external inputs from companies that profit from your disconnection. By 18 months, you're running a closed cycle that produces more food, costs less money, and requires less labor than the disconnected model that's burning you out right now. Time isn't the obstacle. Design is the tool. The moment you stop thinking of animals and gardens as separate projects requiring separate inputs and start treating them as one self-regulating engine, you stop being a customer and become a steward. That Hillbilly Loop, 3 animals and 4 beds working together in continuous cycles, isn't backward. It's the most advanced food production system you can build in a backyard because it runs on relationships instead of products, observation instead of intervention, and biology instead of dependency. You're not primitive for running it. You're sophisticated enough to see what modern marketing tried to hide. Self-reliance doesn't require more money or more space. It requires better design.